Can't be him. And then, as if God himself were winking down at me, the rabbi told a story that I knew well. After the liberation, he recounted. In 1985 in Washington, in front of I don't know how many people dedicating the Holocaust Museum, the rabbi recounted a young boy had asked him a question he could not answer. Where was God? It's him, I said excitedly to Arlene, to his wife. After the ceremony, I found a rabbi. Rabbi Schacter, my name is Martin Greenfield. I was at Buchenwald. I was a little boy who asked you that question. Rabbi Herschel Schacter told me he lived in the Bronx. We stayed in touch until his death in 2013. Every time we visited, no matter the occasion, we relived this story together. But standing there at the Holocaust Museum dedication, with tears streaming down our faces, all we could do was hold on to each other. I didn't want to let go of him, and he didn't want to let go either. And this, to me, I'm going to leave you with this, and I want to turn over the evening to Dr. Medoff. To experience once again that connection. He's now 50-something years old, Martin Greenfield. He's wildly successful in America. To experience once again that connection, to stand with the man who held me as a boy when my spirit had been shattered by the Nazis and their lust for death and darkness, I felt as though I had been kissed by an angel. And that's amazing. So, that's a legacy. Earlier today, my sister and I did a Zoom session for 250 mental health professionals. And this topic was resilience. Resilience after trauma. And I made the point that after trauma, he was a liberator, he wasn't a survivor. Resilience means to present oneself in a meaningful way that someone else could feel if they encountered an angel. So here's what I leave with you. I leave with you the following. I can't do what he did, and I don't save people's lives literally, and I don't do so much, you'll hear from Dr. Medoff. And we're not in that space, but each one of us are in a position where we are, wherever we may be, every single person in this room and who's going to be listening to this, we're in a position to have an impact on people in a very profound way. It's not dramatic, it's not subject of books, but it's a meaningful life. And on this Kristallnacht and on this Veterans Day, when we remember the beginning of the Shoah, we're not talking here about the end, and we remember and express gratitude to so many Americans who made the ultimate sacrifice and went to fight. We ourselves try to imagine, so what can we do? What contribution can we make to the world in which we live? And we can make a profound contribution. I appreciate very much your coming. I'm leaving you with an article that will be published shortly, which is the letter that my father wrote to his parents explaining why he was going to fight, leaving Stanford, even though they desperately were opposed to it. It's a gripping letter, and you'll see the stationery of the shul in the, there's an English part, and then the original has Bar the Asa Rav, the Beis HaKnesset Sagud Shalom, Stamford, Connecticut, in the Hebrew and in the Yiddish. It's right there. There's no address of the shul. I don't know where the shul was in 1941. You know better than I do. Wherever it was, that's what it was. And then he left, and the shul held the job open for him. All the years that he wasn't there, they waited for him to come back. He left in 41, 42. They held the job open. Rabbi Joseph Ehrenkrantz filled in for him during those years as a rabbinical student. And then my father came back from the war, went touring across the United States, telling his story, and told the shul that he wasn't going to come back. At which point Rabbi Ehrenkrantz says, surely you know, became the rabbi. I wish you well. We express gratitude to those who came before us. Gratitude to Rabbi Cohen. Thank you. Rabbi Kurtz, thank you. Particular gratitude to Dr. Medoff for producing an extraordinary work honoring my father, and it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Medoff.
Rabbi Herschel Schacter did not just go to help Jews that one time, to which Rabbi J.J. Schacter just alluded, that episode in 1956 when he went to the Soviet Union, but rather he spent his entire life helping Jews, which is one of the reasons, by the way, it's a big, thick book, because there was a lot to say about a man who lived such a rich and busy life in the Jewish communal world. From that trip to the Soviet Union in 1956, at a time when there was no Soviet Jewry protest movement yet in existence, from then, he went on to become one of the early activists in the Soviet Jewry protests that began in the early 1960s. He then became president of the Religious Zionists of America. And then after that, the first Orthodox rabbi to become chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, the umbrella group for all the major Jewish groups. As if that were not enough, as if I couldn't have written an entire book just up to that point, when his term at the Conference of Presidents concluded, he became head of the major Soviet Jewry organization, the American Conference on Soviet Jewry. And when he finished several years of service there, he went on to become a pro-Israel activist. All during this time, he was still, remarkably enough, the full-time, so to speak, but the rabbi, pulpit rabbi at the Mashalu Jewish Center in the Bronx. What I want to focus on tonight are the two episodes in his life that you've already had something of a glimpse of. The first, the Buchenwald experience. And the second, what you know it's a little closer to home, his experiences right here as the rabbi of Agudas Shalom. I think now you pronounce it Agudat Shalom. Has that become the common? But in those days, it was Agudas Shalom, as far as I can tell. And I want to propose to you an interesting connection between those two apparently very different parts of his life. But first, a bit of a mystery, which I hope you may be able to help me solve. Now, when you study American Jewish history, the general rule of thumb is the further back you go, the less documentation has survived. So in my case, most of my work focuses on the 1930s and 1940s, and with each passing year, it becomes harder and harder to find, first of all, eyewitnesses, people who actually were alive then and have something to share, and also documentation. When I began my research on Herschel Schachter's life, the part where I had the least amount of records, the least amount of firsthand information was, of course, his younger years. So and you'll notice this in the book, that his childhood and adolescence, there's not a lot that I had to go on. And this continued to some extent into his early adulthood, so that the period he was here at Agudas Shalom is a little bit of a mystery. I had some interviews he did many years later where he recalled some incidents that took place here. I want to talk about one of them in particular. But also in terms of documents or photographs of his years in this pulpit, I still cannot pinpoint for certain if any of the photos that survive are of him at Agudas Shalom. And I want to show you now 3 or 4 photos that they're certainly from the 1940s. I can tell that from his physical appearance. And I'm not assuming anyone here remembers exactly what the show looked like in those days. I know you've undergone renovations, and the current renovations look beautiful, by the way. It's obviously undergone a lot of changes since then, but if by any chance anyone can see anything, especially in the background of these photos, that would indicate to you that, yeah, that's us, or no, that's not Stanford, that's the Bronx period, that would be helpful to me. So if I can, we've got There was one just here a moment ago. What do I need to get those photos back up? This screen? I'm afraid not. Can we wake this up? There we go. Thank you very much. There.
Not Stanford.
Anybody, yes or no? Stanford, not Stanford? You can't tell? The Schacter family says it looks like his study in the Bronx, but again, it's a long time ago. If it's Stanford, it's going to be either 1942 or possibly 1946. If it's the Bronx, it's later. Okay, that's one. Let's look at. Can we get at the other ones, Rabbi Kurtz?
Good question.
We should do about 3 of these.
It's probably the top tab. Look at the top tab. You see, you opened up a few tabs.
Oh, there we Sorry. Now, for the style of yarmulke he's wearing here, this is a very 1940s kind of rabbinical attire.
Still wearing that. Shimmy trencher, let's hear it.
This could be the same. It could be the same rabbi study as in this one. Might very well be. Okay, well, while this is getting straightened out, let me continue in any event with my more substantive remarks. Rabbi Schacter spent, believe it or not, 2.5 months in Buchenwald. He was there within hours of its liberation. His job was not to minister to Jewish Holocaust survivors. He was a U.S. Army chaplain. He left Stanford. Could this be Stanford?
No.
You don't think so?
No.
No.
I
Okay.
think that's a Marshall Parkway.
Okay. Let's assume that was Marshall Parkway then. He came to Stanford right out of rabbinical school. In fact, he was the part-time rabbi here while he was still finishing up his rabbinical studies. He graduated, he was ordained. He came here as a full-time rabbi. That was in 1941. And then, of course, in December 41, Pearl Harbor, the United States is in the war, and suddenly his conscience was bothering him. Now, rabbis who were serving congregations, ministers of any religion serving in pulpits, were not required to serve in the military, of course. So he had an automatic exemption, but he was deeply troubled at the idea that other young Jewish men were joining the armed services, and he wasn't. You'll see that in the article that Rabbi J.J. Schacter gave you, in which he talks about his struggle of conscience and his ultimate decision to enlist in the armed forces. So he enlisted as a chaplain, and his job as an Orthodox rabbinical chaplain was to help young Jewish soldiers with their religious needs, organizing davening, organizing religious services, helping them get kosher food, counseling them in personal matters. That was his job. He was stationed in the United States. He petitioned specially to leave a very comfortable post after his initial positions in New Orleans. He was then posted at San Juan, Puerto Rico. And he could have stayed there, but instead he put in a special urgent request and he lobbied to get himself sent to the front. And that's how it happened that he was there with the General Patton's Third Army, which just by chance overran the concentration camp of Buchenwald. I say by chance because although we speak of the American army as the liberators of a number of the concentration death camps, they weren't sent to liberate those camps. They literally stumbled upon the camps by accident. The leadership knew. The political leadership, the Roosevelt administration, the senior army leadership knew about the camps, but soldiers on the ground were not briefed that they might be running into this. And certainly, no one conceived of chaplains having any responsibility to deal with the inmates in these camps. But there, Rabbi Schacter found himself face to face, which, as Rabbi J.J. Schacter has described, with thousands of emaciated, starving, half-crazed Holocaust survivors, and he felt they needed his help. That's where this whole drive in his life to help Jews. This is where it was born. This experience of being confronted face to face with Jews who desperately needed his help. And so he asked his superiors in his unit, the officers, if he could have a permission to remain in the camp instead of staying in the army base nearby in Weimar, or continuing on with troops to other areas. And he was given permission to stay. So for 2.5 months, and this is hard for us today to imagine what this must have been like. As Rabbi Schacter described and you heard him talk about the smoking ovens, he walked into a place where there were piles of dead bodies, where disease was rampant. He was literally putting himself in immediate danger by choosing to stay in the camp. And yet that's what he did for 2.5 months, all the way up until the borders were redrawn and the Soviets took over the area, and he couldn't stay any longer. And for 2.5 months, he devoted himself to the survivors, not to the GIs, the Jewish soldiers to whom he had been officially assigned. Not that he completely neglected them, but his focus was on the survivors in Buchenwald. So there we have, I'm putting these as two separate, but I'm going to show connected experiences. So there we have a man whose life has been, in a moment, transformed. He's gone from this, a Brooklyn European flavored Jewish, rather comfortable life, and suddenly he's in Buchenwald. Before he went off to the army, as we said, he spent about a year and a little more than about a year and a half in this pulpit. Now, when he left Stanford, the assumption, I don't know if it was his assumption, but the assumption of the Herschel board members was certainly that he was going to be coming back. Because this, of course, was an experience, it was not only his experience, there were many other rabbis who served as chaplains, and there was no reason to assume he wouldn't be coming back to Stanford. Before he left, though, before he went overseas, he had a particularly interesting experience that I want to recount. You'll find it in more detail in the book, but because it connects to the larger point I want to make here. So Herschel Schacter began, as I said, with a part-time position here, coming up for Shabbos, leading the shul on Shabbos, and then became full-time. When he took this pulpit, he knew that not everything about the synagogue was exactly the ideal Orthodox practice. And this was a phenomenon common to Orthodox synagogues in America in those days, specifically with regard, well, two things, but let's start with seating, with the mechitza issue. Many synagogues that were officially Orthodox, meaning the siddur, davening was Orthodox, the food was kosher, when it was food in the shul, everything about it was officially Orthodox, but a significant number of the members of the Orthodox synagogues were not personally observant, or let's say were partially observant. This was a reality that young Orthodox rabbis like Herschel Schacter had to address. There was no way around it. If he had stuck to the position he was only going to take a pulpit where they already had a mechitza, completely separate seating, well, that would have left very few pulpits to choose from. So he made he made a choice, which is ideological as well as practical. The choice was to serve American Jews as they were. He had his own ideals. He wanted every synagogue to have separate seating. He wanted a mechitza here in Agudah Shalom, but there wasn't one yet. And so he took this pulpit with the expectation he would gradually be able to persuade the board and the membership to have fully separate Orthodox style seating. Now, as I understand it, in the 1940s, what you had here was an interesting kind of mix where there was a men's section, there was a women's section, there was a kind of a mixed section, and there was no physical barrier between them exactly. So men and women might be sitting separately, but only a short distance apart, and we were just told over dinner that that there was a phenomenon very often of men sitting on the edge, the row closest to the last row on the women's side, so that the husbands and wives are actually within just even a few inches of each other. But technically they were separate, but again, there was also the mixed area. So this area, which Rabbi Cohen called this phenomenon, the his, hers, and ours kind of seating, was not unique to Agudas Shalom. This was, I'd say, more common than not on the Orthodox landscape in America in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. And there were constant, what we call mechitza battles, in which an Orthodox rabbi was trying to get the synagogue to become more strict in its seating procedure, sometimes succeeding, sometimes not. Sometimes these battles ended up in secular court. There are a number of actually kind of almost landmark cases. They have to do with, religious liberty and the extent to which a secular court was willing to intervene in one of these messy, confusing, intra-Jewish squabbles. So that was one aspect of what Rabbi Schacter had to confront in the reality of an American Jewish community where Orthodoxy was not what we know today. Second aspect that he had to deal with was the problem of the timing of Friday night services. This was an issue because a lot of Jewish working men, I'm using this kind of phrase because in those days it was more typical that women were homemakers and men were out in the workforce. So I'm going to refer to it in the terms that were at that time. So it was not uncommon for Jewish working men to be working well past sundown on Friday. And so at times of the year, like now, when Shabbos starts early, it was impossible for them to get, let's say impossible, what I mean is they did not come to shul in time for Friday night services. But Rabbi Schacter wanted them to have an appropriate Jewish experience, some kind of a Jewish experience so they could feel connected. Yes, he could have taken a strict line and said, well, you come on time or don't come at all. But again, he was a person imbibed with the spirit of helping Jews, not looking for ways to say no, not looking for ways to exclude people who are not as observant as he was, but rather for ways to be inclusive. And so he did something which a number of his young rabbinical colleagues were also doing. When I say his young rabbinical colleagues, what I mean is he was part of a generation of Orthodox rabbis who graduated from Yeshiva University's rabbinical school in the 1940s and then went out into the world. And some of them are names that you'll recognize today, like Norman Lamb, for example, was a classmate of his, and at that time a rabbi in Massachusetts, and had a very similar experience to what I'm about to describe. So the idea was to have davening at the appointed time on Friday evenings, whatever the clock required. But then after davening was over, to have a public program, which they would often call they wouldn't call it a Shabbos davening, but it would have a Shabbos-y kind of name to it. And it would be something like, let's say, 8 o'clock. Let's say Shabbos is coming in 5:30, davening is over. Everyone would go home, and then Rabbi Schacter would come back to this very spot at, say, 8 o'clock, is the idea. And then you have a program that would consist of a discussion, sometimes a guest lecturer, and some songs, Jewish songs, Friday night songs, but songs that the singing of which would not technically constitute davening, so you didn't have to have separate seating. All right? There was no Baruch Hu, it wasn't a formal davening, it wasn't Mariv. But songs that made you feel like it was a Shabbos experience, and there would, of course, be some refreshments. So people could be connected, but technically it wasn't davening, so people could sit wherever they want, feel comfortable, and so forth. These were extremely successful programs because they addressed a real need. It was a way to keep people part of the fold, part of this show, even if when they went home, they weren't necessarily fully observant. But Rabbi Schacter told in a much later interview, an anecdote which I include in the book, about something that happened here. So here he was, a fresh new rabbi here, and he came in with this innovative idea. Let's start a program on Friday night at 8 o'clock. And I guess the board or the president kind of went along with it. They didn't know quite what this was all about. This was not something that had been done in the old country, the old ways. This was kind of a new American innovation to address an American reality, an American Jewish reality. But Rabbi Schacter had a kind of a nemesis in the show. There was a board member whose first name seems to have been lost to history, but his last name was Chomsky. Does that ring a bell?
Manuel.
Yes, I see some nodding heads.
Manuel Chomsky.
What was the first name?
Manuel.
Thank you. I wish I called you before I finished writing the book. Because here I have to call him Mr. Chomsky. Now I feel bad about that. Okay, so Manuel Chomsky. I don't know much about it, but I know from Rabbi Schachter's recollection that they kind of locked horns. Personality clash, who knows what. But what happened that very first Friday night when Rabbi Schacter came back here to have his first exciting program, which he'd advertised to everyone in the show, come back at 8 o'clock for songs and refreshments and discussion. He came back to the show, I guess 15 minutes before everyone was due to come back, and the doors were locked. The doors are locked, lights are off, what's going on? And he rummages around, he finds the janitor, and the janitor says, sorry, Mr. Chomsky said, close up, we're not doing any kind of new program. Well, Herschel Schacter would have none of that. And at his insistence, the janitor's insistence, in whatever way you have to say to the non-Jewish janitor to put on the lights, he got that janitor to put on the lights and open up the doors to have that program, and it was a successful program. And in Norman Lamb's memoirs, he talks about doing something almost identical in Springfield, Massachusetts, at his first pulpit, and I found other anecdotal evidence to that effect. So, Chomsky, by the way, Emmanuel Chomsky, grudgingly came to accept that Herschel Schacter was going to have his way. I'm just going to guess here that probably Mr. Chomsky was not brokenhearted when Rabbi Schacter decided to go off and become a chaplain. I don't know how Emmanuel Chomsky got along with Joseph Ehrenkrantz, but hopefully they got along better.
Not too well.
Not too well. So now, deduce from that what you will. But look, Joseph Ehrenkrantz, Rabbi Ehrenkrantz outlasted him, so that says something, right? So, young rabbinical student Ehrenkrantz, as Rabbi J.J. mentioned, came here as the sub, while Herschel Schacter was off in the army. But then, when Herschel Schacter came back,
Excuse me,
after,
sir.
yes,
Can I correct you on that?
please.
After Rabbi Schacter left, we had a Rabbi Cohn here.
Ah,
Not a Rabbi Cohn that's here now.
different common name,
After
Smith Jones
that
Cohen.
Rabbi Cohn, we went into the service also.
Ah.
We had a Rabbi Teicher, who ended up in Montreal after he left there. And it was until 1948 with Rabbi Ehrenkrantz.
And they brought back Rabbi Ehrenkrantz. Well, just as an aside, I suspect that this show has, as you're beginning to give us a sense, a very interesting history, and there could be a book about Agudah Shalom. But my treatment of Agudah Shalom stopped, of course, with the Herschel Schacter period. When Herschel Schacter came back from the war, from that traumatic experience, as Rabbi J.J. mentioned, he didn't right away come back here to this pulpit. Instead, he went around the country as a representative of Jewish organizations, speaking about what he had seen in Buchenwald. So he became, just by default, none of this had been planned, he became by happenstance one of the earliest, most prominent spokesmen for the survivors. Here he was, someone who had actually spent time with them and been helping them and saving lives. And now he came to America to say, this is what's happening, and this was the main point, and this is why we need a Jewish state in Palestine. Because when Herschel Schacter returned after the war, that was the major issue on the Jewish agenda. Will there be a Jewish state? So in 1946, he spent month after month of going around the country speaking about what he had heard. At a certain point, in 1946, he decided that he was going to return. Herschel Schacter decided he would return to synagogue life. But by that time, he apparently had made a personal decision that he wanted to come back to the New York area, to New York City where he'd grown up. And so it looks like he was here at Agudah Shalom for probably a couple of months. There was a little bit of a transition period there, the fall of 46. But then there was an opening at the Mashal Jewish Center in the Bronx. And in those days, the Bronx was still a major area of Jewish settlement. And he ended up spending the entire rest of his rabbinical career at the Mashal Jewish Center, and where immediately he encountered the exact same mechitza problem that he had when he was here in Stanford. He came to the Mashal Jewish Center, and they warned him. He was warned by the rabbinic placement office at Yeshiva University. Look, this is a mixed seating thing, and see what you can do about it. Are you comfortable taking that? And he was comfortable with challenges. Obviously, this is a man who met challenge after challenge in his life and never backed down. So he took on the challenge, but it took a long time. You'll see the whole story in the book. It took a very long time. But again, the reality of Jewish life in the Bronx in the 1950s and 60s was that not everybody at the shul was observant. Now, the interesting thing, though, about these situations, these shuls, whether here or in the Bronx, where they're orthodox, but they're not fully orthodox as we think of today, is that there was, in fact, there always has been a certain conflict between the American calendar and the Jewish calendar, between American life and Jewish life. There's a tension. And I think we do an excellent job. I'm saying as observant Jews, we do a very good job of navigating those conflicts. But the conflicts are there. And we all know them from when having to take off extra time from your job, going to extra lengths to find a place where you could eat, and so forth. All the different things that come up because an observant Jewish lifestyle does not always accord easily with the American calendar and the broader American culture and society. But because of those conflicts between America and traditional Judaism, there was a time, and not so long ago, now I'm talking about the 1950s and the 60s, where all the leading Jewish sociologists predicted that orthodoxy could not survive in America. All the top experts, Jewish demographers and sociologists of that time, wrote extensive and in many ways impressive arguments about why orthodoxy could not survive. There were too many conflicts, that as Jews were moving out to the suburbs, it was going to become too difficult. They were going to start driving to shul because it was too far to walk. And they're going to start sending their kids to public schools because there aren't enough day schools, yeshiva schools, and so forth. This was the widespread expectation. A shul like a good shalom, according to the experts, should not have survived. It should not be here today. The pressures of suburbanization, of American pressure to assimilate, to acculturate, were so great